Next, we're going to talk about how messages flow through the Faxination server. Outbound messages begin at the application layer, also known as the host layer. They move through the server layer for security and permissions and document conversion, and then onto the transport layer, also known as the device layer. Inbound messages are the reverse, beginning in the transport layer, moving through the server layer, and then onto the application layer for delivery. We'll begin with a breakdown of the individual steps for outbound messaging. This provides a really good introduction of the basic functions of the Faxination server. First, we check the user permissions and traffic. Here we're looking at the Faxination tab in Active Directory users and computers, and we can see that our user is enabled for both fax and mobile messaging, including international messaging. They are also permitted to override their cover sheet, charge code, and CSID. The CSID is the small text that you see at the top of each page of a transmitted fax. Note that this user has a CSID defined for them. When this field is blank, the global default configured for the outgoing device service is used. Traffic, also referred to as fenestre limits, refers to the number of Faxination messages that an individual user can send in a specified period of time. Once enabled globally within the Faxination server configurator, limits can be set for individual users and specific to each message type. In this example, we have limited Jamie to 20 fax messages per day. If she exceeds this limit, she will receive a non-delivery report explaining why her message was not transmitted. These same permissions and restrictions can also be configured from the Faxination Address Manager. Faxination features real-time Active Directory integration, so for Active Directory-based users, you're editing the same data regardless of which interface you use. Next, we perform document conversion on any file attachments that accompany the outbound message. For all of the document types supported by Faxination, the end result of this conversion is a TIFF file. Multiple documents per outbound fax will be converted to TIFF and transmitted in the order in which they appear in the outbound message. Next, we set the international prefix. When the outgoing number begins with a plus symbol, that's known as the international format. Microsoft enforces the use of the international format with all Outlook contacts, and the Faxination server needs to know what the plus symbol represents. The plus symbol is replaced with the contents of the international prefix field on the General tab of the Faxination server configurator. When you have a phone number in the international format, it gives you all of the information that you need to directly dial that number, with the exception of the exit code, which is also known as the International Access Code or the International Direct Dialing Code. These are digits that you must provide to indicate that you're making a call outside of your country. These digits will vary depending on what country you're calling from, and sometimes even what telephony provider you're using within that country. The most common exit code by far is just 00. Now this is not an exhaustive list, but if you're a Fenestre customer and your exit code is 00, you'll probably see your country listed here. The second most common exit code is 011. That's the exit code for the United States, and a lot of these countries you may recognize as U.S. territories. Canada is also on this list because the U.S. and Canada both use the North American numbering plan, and the border between the countries is basically ignored from a telephony standpoint. This is a complete list of all of the 011 exit codes in use today. And these are some of the exceptions and variations across the globe. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but the main takeaway here is that wherever Faxination is installed, the server needs to be configured with the international exit code for proper dialing. You can get away with ignoring this in single server environments with only local Faxination users by requiring the outgoing faxes to be addressed explicitly for the local dialing rules. But in larger organizations with users potentially in other countries, or when remote fax devices are being used for least cost routing, the correct international prefix configuration becomes a requirement. In our example, the Faxination server is based in the United States, and the international access code is 011. So an outbound fax beginning with +1678 translates to 0111678. Next, we need to perform number substitution. Each fax device will have its own number substitution configuration that will modify outbound fax numbers for local dialing rules. For a Faxination server based in Atlanta, Georgia in the United States, we've created a rule for 0111678. In this case, 678 is a local area code, so we don't need to dial the international exit code or the long distance 1, so this rule replaces those digits with 678. It's best to think of number substitution as a subtractive process. In most cases, you should only be removing or replacing digits using number substitution. Also, if you find yourself creating more than around 10 number substitution rules, you may want to rethink your approach. The chances are you haven't quite grasped the concept. Next, we create the message along with a cover sheet when required. We then back up the message according to the setting in the General tab of the Faxination Server Configurator. You can set the number of days to retain backups of all inbound and outbound messaging on the server, along with the document type you wish to use for backup files. In this case, we've licensed the optical character recognition module, so we have the option to save our backups in PDF with OCR format. If the backup option is enabled but configured for 0 days, that's a special configuration that tells the server that backups never expire, and those files will be stored indefinitely. In that scenario, just be aware of high volume environments or small partitions where you might be at risk of filling up the hard drive. Outbound message backups are stored in the kernel out folder by default. It is possible to change this location to another local or UNC path, and we'll discuss that when we get into the details of the Faxination Server Configurator later in the training. Next, we check to see if any outbound service routing rules can be applied to the outgoing message. Outbound service routing is typically used when the Faxination server has remote devices and you want to ensure that the most appropriate device is used to transmit the message. The outgoing number that is tested against outbound service routing is after setting the international exit code, but before the local number substitution. In this case, we have a local fax device in Atlanta called INOUT, along with remote fax devices in the UK, Spain, the Netherlands, and Brazil. In this example, we're sending an outbound fax to 01131, and we have an outbound service routing rule that associates any outbound number beginning with those digits with a remote fax device in the Netherlands called INOUT-NL. So this routing type is based on destination address. For the message type fax, beginning with 01131, use service INOUT-NL, and this rule is enabled. Now we apply number substitution again, but this time using the dialing rules that are unique for that remote device. In the case of dialing a Dutch number from our remote fax device that is also in the Netherlands, we need to strip away the international exit code and the country code and replace those with a 0. Once the outgoing fax has been submitted to the device, we wait to determine the success or failure of the fax transmission. By default, we will attempt to transmit the fax 5 times with a 60-second delay between each attempt. If the fax is not delivered within those limits, the sender will receive a non-delivery report by default, and the reason for the failure will be contained within the report when it's available. Common failure messages include ringing no answer and busy. Brook Trout cards will report possible human detected if they hear a human voice instead of fax tones. If the number is out of service, you may receive an error like special vacant tone detected. In all of these cases, the sender will want to check the number and maybe dial it using a regular phone to see if it's correct and in service. Once the success or failure of the outgoing fax has been determined, we write an entry to the Faxination log. Inbound message flow originates in the transport layer. And the first thing the server does is determine who the incoming message is intended for. All of the fax devices supported by Faxination have a way of receiving incoming routing digits, whether it's analog DTMF tones, digital ISDN data, or part of the fax over IP session request. In this case, the telephony system is configured to pass only the last 4 digits of the fax number that was dialed. In this environment, that's enough to ensure that all of the inbound routes will be unique. In larger environments, you can route based on any number of digits, up to the full fax number if required. Next, Faxination will search through Active Directory and its own SQL database, looking for users that have that routing code. In this case, Gary Tom is found to have a matching routing code, and he is an Exchange user. Next, we create a backup of the message. Inbound messages are saved to the kernel in folder by default when the backup option is enabled. Next, by default, we create a log entry for this message. Now we create the body text that will accompany the message when it is delivered to the recipient. This includes some technical information about the transmission, the Faxination job reference, and so forth. And then the message is delivered to the user. Inbound routing codes do not have to be unique, so Gary's routing code could also be associated with one or more printers, network folders, web services, SharePoint libraries, or even other Exchange users.